I'm Neetha Bidway. Welcome to Good Revenue. Today, we're going to talk about the latest news with the economy. We'll also get into a recent cybersecurity threat you should be aware of. And finally, we're going to do a quick dive into US agriculture and the state of farming. As always, you can find links and resources to everything we talk about in the show notes. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much for joining us. First up, let's talk about inflation and imbalance in the US economy. We have some bad milestones that we've hit this week. Unfortunately, the federal debt is at $38 trillion, and inflation is holding steady at about 3%. Gasoline is up 4.1% year over year, and currently we're unsure about the state of the consumer price index. It's delayed due to the federal government shutdown. One additional challenge for us is that the Federal Reserve is effectively flying blind in many ways. Not only are they not receiving the BLS data that they typically get on a regular basis, but it also turns out that they're no longer receiving private payroll employer data via ADP. And that is really concerning because whatever your opinion is of the Fed and how we make decisions, it is heavily data backed. And so the lack of that data is a real problem. A private donor has committed to covering $130 million of salary costs for US troops. That's a first in US history, and I think probably not a great first. In addition, SNAP benefits are going to end on November 1st, also due to the shutdown. Now, this is really tragic because SNAP benefits cover 42 million households in the United States. So we can expect some really wide ranging damage to a lot of people and families because of that. And finally, healthcare premiums are rising dramatically, and we are about to enter open enrollment here in the US in November. Now, assuming we can get through all of those massive challenges that I just listed, there are a number of economic wildcards that I think are worth a quick minute. One of those has to do with the fact that we really do seem to be entering the GLP-1 economy. The Harvard Business Review just published data held by PwC. They've covered 11,000 households with GLP-1 use. And what they're finding is a dramatic change in spending patterns. Specifically, grocery spending declines by 6 to 8% after a year of a household using GLP 1s. And that money is being redirected to apparel, travel, dining, and other things. Our second story is energy. We've talked a lot about the rapacious need of AI and tech for energy and the fact that our US energy grid is really maxed out right now. So, this energy has to come from somewhere. There's a very interesting story in PitchBook this week about a financial deal between Blue Owl Capital and Meta. And that has to do with the fact that Blue Owl is going to own 80% of this joint venture, and Meta still has the right to walk away, which leaves the question of who is going to end up holding the bag if the AI bubble bursts. And based on the fact that this data center is really only intended for AI use, if there isn't any AI customer, it really does seem like the locality in which this is situated is probably going to end up holding the bag. And this amount of power that we're talking about here is twice the power of New Orleans. And this particular facility is going to be built in Louisiana. Our third story, copyright has become a currency. Reddit is suing Perplexity as well as some AI data scraping companies. They set a trap for Perplexity, according to this lawsuit. And what appears to have happened is that they provided some test data that showed up in Google search results, and then it somehow found its way into Perplexity. And so Reddit is alleging that Perplexity illegally stole this data via AI data scrapers who are effectively laundering copyrighted materials. In this case, in Reddit's case, it's actually the comments from Reddit users that they consider to be proprietary and that they want to be compensated for. So, this is the latest interesting question in the wider policy issue of what is intellectual property actually worth and who owns it, and should people be fairly compensated for it? And depending on that, I think there's a lot of economic ramifications because if you are a copyright owner or a copyright creator, I think that all the incentives go away if you can't monetize that asset anymore. The latest cybersecurity threat, Palo Alto's Unit 42 tracked 195,000 smishing domains since 2024. I know it's kind of a weird word. These domains seem to be mostly registered in Hong Kong. However, they are largely hosted in the United States, in China, and in Singapore. Now, this scam is apparently impersonating toll booths, healthcare, financial services, lots of critical systems. And so, if you've gotten one of those little messages that says you're overdue on your toll booth bill or whatever, that's likely what this scam is tied back to. It's a real problem for two reasons. One, it's been very difficult for researchers to track at cybersecurity companies, and that's because these domains are short lived. They're used for a quick period of time and then something else is being used. So it's hard to actually track them. And secondly, the problem here is the goal of this hack appears to be to steal personal data and household information, other really sensitive materials in order to effectuate a future attack. So nothing is happening right now, potentially, but something really bad may happen in the future. That's what the researchers think. Our final story, we're going to talk about agriculture and farming. And there are five things I think are really important to know as we level set around this. In 2002, the United States undertook a census of agriculture, and that was led by the USDA. That's the US Department of Agriculture. They found that for the first time since the Civil War, we have fewer than 2 million farms. So even going into 2025, the US is at a historic inflection point when it comes to farms, particularly those owned by families or just smaller farms. Now, the more current data in 2025 is as follows. Net income rose 41% to $180 billion. dollars. But unfortunately, this isn't good news because that is due to disaster aid payments, not because farmers are actually selling more crops and livestock. Third, federal aid has increased 300%. It tops $40 billion. It's a huge amount of money and it's not sustainable over the long term. Fourth, livestock receipts are at a record high of $300 billion, and crops, unfortunately, are at a 20-year low. So you can see a real difference there in sectors. And finally, the cost of farming has gone up dramatically. It's increased about almost $12 billion to $467 billion, and margins have tightened. So being a farmer is less profitable and more challenging. And there are, in addition to tariffs, the taxes that you're paying on tariffs, the problem has to do with taxes generally, labor costs, and other inputs. Now, the impact of tariffs and trade specifically can't be overstated. Our most valuable crop is soybeans in terms of export value. And soybean farmers, particularly in states like Iowa, have had an awful year. They just have not been able to sell anything because the Chinese, which has been the largest customer of soybeans, they've stopped buying thanks to the trade war between the United States and China. China also increased its import duty to 34%, meaning that even if American farmers could export successfully to China, they couldn't compete on price. And Argentina and Brazil have really stepped up. China is now sourcing a lot of soybeans from both of those countries. In addition to the billions of dollars that farmers have lost, and it's close to $6 billion dollars in terms of value to soybean farmers, in addition to that, cotton, corn, wheat, pork, and other crops, all of those have declined this year. Tree nuts, specifically almonds, are also having a very difficult time being sold into Asia. And finally, beef exports, which we mentioned up top, were actually in a better position, might not be because the US might start importing beef from Argentina, which is not making cattlemen and ranchers very happy. And we'll take one quick minute on Argentina. This has been a completely bizarre geopolitical issue, but the US is committing $20 billion to Argentina to help bail them out in the middle of our government shutdown and all of the other things that we've just listed that are challenging for us here in the US. And this is particularly odd because over the past 50 years, the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, has tried to bail Argentina out 20 times. And the core problem is that Argentina spends too much money and has not been able to actually write its own budget long term. So there's a lot more going on in terms of the politics here in the United States and the politics in Argentina. But nonetheless, everything that's happening here may also come back to affect US agriculture too. And the last piece of this is the US is also leaning on Argentina to try to keep lithium and copper, which is in Argentina, away from the Chinese. So it appears to be the long tail of the US China trade war. Now, speaking of that trade war, our last story, the US and China have been in a huge fight for the last 7 months. It's primarily about trade and economics, but really it's about geopolitics and dominance in the world. The US and China are set to meet later this week. And while we're hopeful that they may actually come up with a more durable, stable agreement, there are a number of huge issues on the table which really don't seem like they're going to be solved in the short run. And they include AI chip exports, ownership of TikTok, everything we've just talked about when it comes to agriculture, fentanyl imports, and a host of other manufacturing and sourcing issues. So it's a very complicated issue, and I think it's more likely that we'll have another short term peace. But I suspect that the longer term conflict between the US and China is going to continue for the foreseeable future. That's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, leave us a review, subscribe to the show, or check out another episode. We appreciate your support.